Hello, and welcome back to Historical Terminology. Today we're going to be talking about the Cold War, or as I call it, the conflict in the shadows. The Cold War is a defining conflict in the lives of many people who are alive today, and the repercussions of it are still affecting global policy across the world. So it's important to understand exactly what the Cold War is and why it's so important. So let's get started. So what exactly was the Cold War? Well, it was a war of ideologies that took place between the United States and the Soviet Union from the end of the Second World War until the 1990s. Now, the United States and the Soviet Union were the main combatants, but other nations took part. The United States had allies in Western Europe, and they worked together to kind of combat Soviet attempts to do things. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union also had allies around the world that were also trying to spread their ideologies. So the Cold War has many different players involved. And it's called the Cold War because the main combatants, the US and the USSR, never actually fought against each other. Instead, they were funding groups who opposed each other, used espionage. They were doing things to kind of get the upper hand against each other, but they weren't actually fighting. There was never a battle where the Soviets and the American soldiers fought against each other. It's not that kind of war. So how did the Cold War start? Well, when World War II ended, the United States, which was a capitalist democracy, and the Soviet Union, a communist dictatorship, were the two strongest nations in the world, and they both wanted to share their ideology with others. So they wanted other countries to be like them, and so they'd spend the next 50 or so years trying to spread their ideals and gain the upper hand on the other so that their ideology would be the winner. So let's talk about the two sides that we've kind of set up here in this Cold War. The first is the United States and their allies. And if you can see this map down here, all of those blue countries were allies of the United States in their fight against the Soviet Union. All of these Western European allies and a few other countries supported democracy, open markets, things that the United States liked. The U.S. also created NATO, which was a military alliance set on opposing Soviet aggression. So they're basically saying if the Soviet Union attacks any of us, they'll be fighting all of us instead of just the one country. On the other hand, the Soviet Union had a similar situation going on. They had puppet governments that they created in Eastern European states that followed the party line in Russia, and they believed in communism and authoritarian single-party rule. So the countries in the Soviet sphere of influence were forced to kind of sign into the Warsaw Pact, which was a similar military alliance. And this is the symbol of the Warsaw Pact. As you can see, you've got a couple different types of flags in here, like Western or Eastern Germany, Poland, Romania, all these different countries that were in that Russian sphere of influence. So let's talk a little bit about the ideologies at play here. So on the one side, we were talking about the United States, who believed in democracy and a free market. Democracy is where citizens have a say in the government and either vote directly on items of importance or elect representatives to vote for them. In that case, it's called a republic, but America kind of conflates that with democracy. And then economically, they were a free market economy, which is where the government has little control over supply and demand. There's limited or no government intervention or regulation, and the market is free to do as it wishes. Same on the other side, right? The Soviets had their own views. The Soviets ruled through authoritarianism, which is a highly centralized government where one person, or in case of the Soviets, they had one person as a figurehead, but they had a committee that also helped make decisions and rules. And there was only one political organization, which was the Communist Party. So there's only one view that was allowed. And then communist economies are command economies, where the government decides what's made, when it's made, and what price it will sell. So everything is top down in a communist economy. So let's talk about a few of the conflicts that occurred during the Cold War. Now, just because it was called the Cold War doesn't mean that there weren't conflicts. There were wars during this time, but they were never directly between the Soviet Union and the United States. It was always between the United States and a country's being helped by the Soviet Union or the Soviet Union against a country that was being held by the United States. It was never a direct conflict. So first of all, there was a nuclear arms race that happened after the Second World War. And when the war ended, the United States was the only country that had an atomic weapon, and they had used them on Japan at the end of World War II. Now, Russia had seen what had happened, the Soviets did, and they were like, we need to have those too if we're going to stand a chance against the United States. And so they began to work on their own bombs. And over the course of those 50 years, there was a big race to see who could make the biggest, the strongest, and the fastest weapons and missiles that could carry these weapons across the world. One of the first open conflicts during the Cold War was the Korean War. In the 50s, the two Koreas went to war. The North was backed by the Soviets and the Chinese, and the South was backed by the US, and they fought for supremacy over their peninsula. They wanted to be a united Korea. At least the North did. The North attacked the South. It wasn't the other way around. The United States sent troops and spent millions of dollars supporting South Korea, while the USSR sent weapons, money, and air support to the North. The war did end. However, it was a stalemate, and the border between the two nations has been militarized ever since. So there is a line where North Korea and South Korea meet, and on both sides of those lines are just a bunch of guns pointed at each other. That's how it's been for the last 50 or so years. Technically, I think the Korean War still hasn't ended, but there hasn't been open hostilities in a long time. Another big conflict during this Cold War period was the Cuban Missile Crisis. In the 60s, the United States placed missiles in Turkey to halt Soviet aggression and as kind of a last resort defense against attack for Western Europe. In response, the USSR sent missiles to Cuba. And Americans didn't like that because, as you can see from this picture up here, Cuba is within easy striking distance of the entire eastern coast of the United States. So President Kennedy, who was president at the time, set a blockade of Cuba and ordered the Soviets to back down. They're like, "Hey, you're going to put missiles there. We're gonna have words." The world narrowly avoided a nuclear war, and the Soviets chose to bring their missiles back home, and they did not put nuclear missiles in Cuba. This was probably the closest time in the Cold War that it ever came to open hostilities between the Soviets and the Americans. Had this not gone as well as they had hoped, there could have actually been a nuclear war. Another conflict during this time was the space race, the race to get a man on the moon. The United States and the Soviet Union tried to be the first people into space, and the first people to kind of successfully do something space race-wise was Russia, when they launched Sputnik, which was a satellite in 1957. And that kind of scared the United States. They had no idea that Russia had even been working on this. And that's when the United States started funding NASA fully. And by 1969, the Americans had the first astronaut on the moon. So clearly they took this loss to heart and have gone on. Russia and the United States both still have great space programs, and now we work together. The International Space Station is manned mostly by an international coalition of astronauts, but about half of them are Russian, and then the other half are Western European American. Another conflict during the Cold War was the Vietnam War. Very similar to the Koreas, Vietnam had been divided into two countries after World War II. After colonialism ended, one was backed by the USSR, which was in the north, and the other was backed by the US in the south. And North Vietnam, which was financed by China and the USSR, invaded the South to try to take over the entire peninsula. The United States deployed troops to keep South Vietnam in their sphere of influence. That went on to be a 20-year-long conflict, which the United States lost, and they ended up evacuating Vietnam in 1975. And this is a picture of that happening. They're trying to get people on helicopters and sending them out. Vietnam was a vicious war. And in all honesty, the Americans committed an incredible amount of war crimes in Vietnam, which we probably still have not answered for. One of the other major open conflicts during the Cold War was when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan. In the 1980s, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan due to a rise in resistance activity against the Soviet-backed government. The resistance fighters were funded and equipped by the United States and other nations like Pakistan, the UK, and China. And the Soviets did end up getting defeated by the resistance fighters, and they had to leave Afghanistan. It was a big, embarrassing loss for them. The final big part about the Cold War was the espionage and spying that happened. If you've ever watched an older James Bond movie, right, James Bond did a lot of spying against Russians in his early movies because of the Cold War. Soviet and American spies played this game of espionage all across the planet, and spies were often used to overthrow governments in other continents like South America, Africa, and the Middle East. And both countries' spy agencies, the KGB and the CIA, were highly trained and effective. They did this many times over the course of the 50-year Cold War. The Cold War ended when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. There are several reasons why the why the USSR collapsed. One of which being the growing spending that was going into this conflict. During the presidency of Ronald Reagan, the United States began spending incredible amounts of money on the military and other programs, and the USSR just did not have the economic oomph to keep up with U.S. spending. Now, also, Mikhail Gorbachev became the leader of USSR, and he began to try to reform the Soviet government. His two main pushes were perestroika, which was to open up the economy to markets and end planned economies, and glasnost, an opening of the government and information. Now, unfortunately, when he did this, there began to be rebellion and independence in Eastern Europe. So during Gorbachev's time, Soviet governments in Eastern European countries would fall and would leave the Soviet sphere. And he would also allow Germany to reunite. Growing nationalism in these republics couldn't be stifled, which kind of led to the shift away from the Soviets. Finally, all these bad things kind of led to a head, and hardliners in the Russian government tried to depose of Gorbachev and install a more traditional Soviet leader in 1991. The coup would fail, and Gorbachev would remain in power, but his grip on the USSR was so weakened that afterwards, the Soviet Union would end up dissolving. All the different republics would create new countries, and the USSR fell apart. Basically, Gorbachev was the president of a country that didn't exist anymore. The USSR was replaced with the CIS, which was a much looser, non-binding intergovernmental organization, the Confederation of Independent States. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you can like, subscribe, ring the bell, and drop a comment.
And I'm here too.
Thank you, Cameron. And leave a comment. Let me know what you'd like to learn about so that I can make stuff for you guys. Thanks for watching. See you later.